As far as controllers go, I've been using the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth for the better portion of the last year since I bought it. This is a pretty good controller, and overall I like a lot about it. The ergonomics are great, we have full Hall stick joysticks, and we also have some nice triggers. However, there is one big fault about this controller that I do not like, and that would be these. These joysticks unfortunately do not have an anti-friction ring around them, so that means that this joystick stem is going to wear away at the shell here. I am slightly concerned about the durability of this controller though, as I've already RMA'd it once and 8BitDo made me pay for the return. I've been looking for a good controller with the same features that has some anti-friction rings on it. If I could find a controller like that, I can tell I would be pretty happy. The other controller that I really do appreciate is the King Kong Pro 2 controller. This is also another really good controller, and we got some good joysticks, but these don't feel as smooth. I also really am not a fan of these clicky bumpers, as they're pretty loud. What if there was a way to combine both of these controllers to get the best out of both and put it into one controller? This is the EasySMX X10 Mechanic Master. This controller was sent over by a company called EasySMX. I haven't really heard of them before, and I really think this controller has a lot of cool features to it. Let's take a closer look at it and see if it can combine these two controllers to give us something truly special. From the gunmetal design to these nice grips here and these silver joysticks, I think this looks really good. So what sets this out from the competition? Let's take a closer look at what this controller is before we open it and take a closer look at it. Just a full disclosure, this was sent to me by the company, but they're not paying me for this review and all opinions are my own. They're also not seeing this review before it goes live. Let's take a closer look at the X10 Mechanic Master and see if this is the right controller for you. I know for me anyways, I've been really impressed with this controller over the week I've had using it. As of making this video, this controller is currently up on their website for $49 US. So what does that get you? The joysticks and the triggers on this controller are Hall based, so we're gonna get some good durability out of those. If you don't know, Hall sensors are highly drift resistant, so this is definitely gonna last a good while. We also have some swappable magnetic covers with this controller, and I think that's pretty cool. I definitely like this silver one the best though, so that's probably the one I'll stick with, but we can take a closer look at this white one as well. We also have microswitches for the ABXY buttons. We have a nice D-pad, and we'll take a closer look at that later, and we have some paddle buttons on the back. Another good feature about this controller is the compatibility, so we can play this on our Switch, over the 2.4 GHz USB dongle. We can also use this wired or Bluetooth. Out of the rest of their controllers here though, I do think that spending that little extra to get this one is definitely worth it. Let's take a closer look at the silver one here and see if it's the right controller for you. Taking a look at the box itself, we have some of the features up here on the front. On the back, we have an overview of the controller and some of the specs on the controller itself. Let's open it up and take a closer look inside. Inside the box, we have some documentation. We also have an instruction manual, and I do recommend keeping this because you're going to need this later. This shows us how to connect to all our different modes, how to use our turbo. It also shows us how to shut it off and how to adjust the vibration. So you definitely want to keep that. Let's set this aside. Underneath that, we have the controller itself. We also have the 2.4 GHz USB dongle. I gotta say, I love the silver color, and I think this looks absolutely amazing on this controller. Let's set aside the controller and see what else is in the box. I didn't think there was anything else in the box, but this liner actually comes out and there is something underneath. Underneath we have our USB cable, and overall this feels like a very sturdy USB cable. It is also quite flexible though, and it's braided. This is an extremely long cable and it feels about 4 feet. This is just a standard USB-C cable, so if you're looking for a replacement, you can get those pretty easy on Amazon. In the bottom of the box, we also have a swappable faceplate, and we get some white grips as well. I'm not a fan of white controllers as I just find they get too dirty over time, but my ROG Ally still looks to be in really good shape even though it's white, so white is kind of growing on me. There's a little spot here underneath the bottom on the front that you can just lift up, and these come right off. Once you peel that off, it's pretty easy to put the new one on. This gives you a couple different possibilities with matching the colors. So you could have white grips with silver, or you could swap this out for white and have black grips, or vice versa. You can lift up the front plate as well from the bottom middle here. So it did take a little bit to get it up, but what I ended up doing was pulling it from the bottom middle and from the top middle as well, and then just pulled it up straight and it came off pretty easy. That goes on there easy too. I do really like it when a controller has swappable faceplates. I think this is a really cool way to refurbish your controller once the old one's looking a little scuffy. But I really do like that silver and black one, so I'm gonna swap that back. First off, let's talk about the build quality. This definitely feels like a solid controller, and the plastic quality is pretty decent. It's not a hard plastic like you're gonna find on the 8BitDo Ultimate, but it's not a soft plastic like you're gonna find on the King Kong Pro 2 controller. This is somewhere in the middle, and I think it's a pretty good balance of both. It also feels really solid. The back plastic also feels really good too. With black controllers or devices in general, you get a lot of fingerprints, but because this has a subtle texture to it, it does actually resist fingerprints pretty good. I'm not a fan of these phone attachments, but that's just a personal thing. If you want this for your phone, they do sell an attachment for this separately, I believe. The triggers feel really good, and the bumpers also feel really excellent as well. The joystick quality also feels really good too. These joysticks feel as good as what you would see on the 8BitDo Ultimate. All in all, the controller build quality, I would say this is excellent. I would give this controller probably a solid 8 in the build quality department. I do like a harder plastic on my controllers, but the soft plastic is excellent quality, and the texture really adds to the overall grippiness of the controller. In terms of weight, this comes in at 247 grams. With that in mind, this puts it nearly on par with the 8BitDo Ultimate. This is 244 grams. That explains why these two controllers feel so similar. At 219 grams, the King Kong Pro 2 is definitely the lightest. I don't really feel much difference between these two controllers here, but this one does feel slightly lighter. I don't think this is a heavy controller at all, and I don't think the weight's going to bother you. I do believe that the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth was the perfect weight for a controller, so having only a few grams heavier still puts this in really perfect territory. I think they did a really good job on the size of this controller. The buttons come in at 10.2 millimeters. To put this into perspective, the ones on the King Kong Pro 2 come in at 10.4 millimeters, and the ones on the 8BitDo Ultimate are slightly smaller at 9.8. This is kind of hard to show, but the joystick height on the 8BitDo Ultimate is 7.7 millimeters. This is identical on the King Kong Pro 2. Because of the cap size, these ones are slightly taller at 8.8 millimeters. This definitely feels like a good size for a controller. I do love the button sizes and the joystick height. Something that makes this controller stand out, however, is the fact that it's using microswitches. These do have a very subtle click to it, and I think they're pretty nice. I'm not a fan of switches as I kind of find them pretty loud, but this is definitely not over the edge with how loud these are. We also have a very gamery style font on there, and I think that matches the silver look pretty good. Correct me if I'm wrong, but microswitches are more responsive than rubber membrane switches. When I saw this had microswitches, I definitely thought that was going to be bothersome, but that's not bothering me at all. After we go over the D-pad, we'll do a quick sound test to show you what these sound like. The D-pad also uses switches, and you do have to push it down a little bit for it to register, but I don't think that's bad by any means. It also feels like a really good D-pad, and you can roll it pretty easy. I think that's because there's a little bit of space between the D-pad here, and that makes it pretty easy to roll this. The D-pad has a slight pivot in the center, but this D-pad is definitely on the stiff side. I don't think this is bad by any means, but that's definitely something to note before buying it. If you don't want a stiff D-pad, I would definitely look at something that has rubber membrane switches. Now that we've talked about the controller a little bit though, let's check out how these sound. One thing a lot of first-party controllers forget is to have a proper anti-friction ring. These joysticks do feel really smooth, and that's because there's an anti-friction ring around the opening here. Up to this point, the only controller that I had that had one of these was the King Kong Pro 2, and that was definitely one of the best features of the controller. I did have to use joystick protectors on the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth, but they slide up and down, so they're not a perfect fix. This controller also does wear away quite quickly on this joystick. This is definitely the biggest fault that I have with this controller. It just doesn't feel very durable thanks to that. Thanks to the anti-friction ring on the X10, we don't have that issue here. These joystick caps are rubber and there's a slight grip around the outside. These are also concave, so it makes it really easy to get a good grip on them. On the front of the controller, we also have our select button and our start button. We also have a settings button. This is our home button, so this is how we would turn on the controller. And all we have to do is just to press that and it'll turn on. We also have our LED notification here. On the top of the device, we have our 2 bumpers and we have our 2 triggers. We also have our USB-C charging port and we have a mounting rail for our phone. The bumpers are microswitch based and we have Hall triggers as well. These feel very smooth. I also really like this texture that they have on the bumpers and the triggers. On the bottom of the controller, we have a turbo button and a vibration adjustment button. I do find this controller actually has pretty decent rumble, and you can kind of see when I'm adjusting this just how powerful it is. These buttons also have little labels on them so you can see which is which. We have 2 programmable paddles on the back. We also have a reset hole, and we have the mode adjustment. If you're using the 2.4 GHz USB dongle like I am, you're going to want to slide this all the way to the end, closer to the M2. They also didn't label this on the back, and I think that's their biggest mistake here with this controller. Without knowing what this is, I have no idea which mode I'm on. The only way that I figured out which mode this was by checking in the manual. If you look very closely in the manual here, you can see the different modes. So we have Nintendo Switch, followed by Bluetooth, then wired, then our 2.4 GHz USB dongle. So don't lose your manual because you're not going to know which mode you're in. I suppose you could also make a small label for the back showing you which mode you're in, but that's just a shame to see. Let's do a quick test of the controller itself. Starting off with these triggers, you can see how smooth these triggers are. These are some of the most precise triggers that I've ever seen on a controller. And the buttons all work well. We can do a quick test on the circularity on these joysticks too. And Hall joysticks tend to be very accurate. The King Kong Pro 2 controller gets 0.5 on both of these, so this is slightly more accurate than the Gully Kit controller. You can also see that both of these joysticks snap back to the perfect center, and you can move them ever so slightly and you'll still get it registered. All in all, these are very good joysticks. Turbo is really easy to get working too. All you have to do is to hold the button down and turbo at the same time and it'll activate turbo mode. Then when you're pressing the button in question, the turbo should automatically activate. This is really handy in games like Skull the Hero Slayer, where by default you're going to have to press X every single time to attack. With the macro on though, all you have to do is hold it down. So this works out pretty good. The other thing I'm noticing is that the input latency is really good on this controller. I've given this a good test in a couple games here, and I haven't had any issues in terms of input latency. Out of all the controllers that I own actually, this one feels the most responsive. Even playing with this on the Nintendo Switch gives us some excellent latency results. As soon as I press the button, you're noticing it almost instantly on the screen. In fact, I would say that this is probably one of the best controllers for the Switch that I've ever used. And the D-pad is pretty good for this as well. It is a little stiffer as mentioned earlier, but I don't really find that bothering me. So far, I think I'm pretty impressed with this controller. We've got a good connection through the 2.4 GHz USB dongle, through wired, of course, and Bluetooth, and even on the Nintendo Switch, I'm not having any issues whatsoever. I did manage to measure the input latency on this controller once through 2.4 GHz, but for some reason the test isn't working again. The first time I measured it, it went up to 400 Hz with 4 milliseconds input latency, and I definitely believe that. What do you guys think of this controller so far? As far as the controller goes so far, I think the biggest things for me are these awesome triggers. I absolutely love these. I also didn't think I was going to be a big fan of these micro switches, but they're really starting to grow on me. These are also really good joysticks. So far, I haven't really found any fault with this controller, and that's surprising because this just came out of nowhere. If they had labeled those modes, I think this would have been a really easy recommendation, and it still is. These modes are going to be pretty easy to remember anyways, especially if you're using this controller for a lot of devices. You're going to remember that pretty quick. But just labeling them would have made it a lot easier. As far as the controller goes, I can definitely recommend this, and for $49 it's not bad. It does compete with the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth, but I do think that those anti-friction rings are definitely this one's standout feature. We have those anti-friction rings, you're getting those nice micro switches, you're getting good input latency, and a good D-pad. These faceplates are a really handy feature, and if you get a little mark on it, you can just pull it off and put a new one on there. The turbo mode worked really good, and I can see myself using that for a lot of Switch games. I do actually like this more than the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth, and I do think I like it better than the King Kong Pro 2 as well. It is a lot easier to tell which mode that the King Kong Pro 2 controller is in though, because they're labeled. If they had just added that label, that would have been a really nice thing to have on here. I'm not a fan of these small bumpers and the triggers here on the 8BitDo Ultimate Bluetooth. I do think that the long bumpers like this feel way better to use, and they're definitely more ergonomic. I don't mind either controller though. So what do you guys think about the EasySMX X10? I absolutely love this controller, and I'm really excited to see what this company comes out with down the road. I'll update the pinned comment below if I have any future issues with this, but for now, I really think it's a good controller. If you have any questions regarding the X10, make sure to let me know in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.